including a trophy wife.
He was really in love with her. He had a strong affinity, and he lavished her with gifts.
She was the sort of person that wanted to be a rich, kept woman.
Until a brutal crime shattered their comfortable life together and exposed a sinister plot.
It looked like someone had tried to cover up the scene.
The damage was so severe that they couldn't even identify the body.
It was a mystery that would take investigators into a world of gambling and prostitution to catch a killer driven by greed.
This was not a run-of-the-mill murder. This was like something out of a Hollywood movie.
Lust, betrayal, a deadly triangle, you name it, it was involved in this case.
October 31st, 2002. It's 9 a.m. on a Monday morning in the small town of Huyton, outside of Liverpool, England. A warehouse owned by a local trading company is about to open for the day.
This warehouse is on an industrial estate, so there's no houses. It's not a residential area.
The owner of the premises, a Mr. Canavan, went to work that morning at 9 o'clock. He saw blood in the passage entrance. There were bloody footprints.
Canavan follows the trail into a back room, where he makes a horrifying discovery. Lying on the floor is the dead body of a man, and there is blood everywhere.
The local police responded, and they in turn contacted the major incident room, and I went down as the senior investigating officer to take charge of the scene. I examined the body. He was basically unrecognisable. It looked as though he'd been shot in the face. And there appeared to be shotgun damage to the ceiling. There were shotgun pellets that were recovered from the ceiling.
The damage to the victim's head is so severe that making a positive identification proves difficult.
His jacket had been partially removed, the sleeves were inside out. When we searched the victim's clothing, we found identification relating to a Gerald Gilbert.
Canavan tells police that Jed Gilbert worked for him as a sales manager. He has no idea why anyone would shoot him.
The office had a floor safe, and the cover to the floor safe had been removed, but there'd been no attempt to try and find the keys to the safe.
Had Jed interrupted a burglary in process, or was there something more sinister at play? Everyone who knew him says 46-year-old Jed Gilbert was an industrious businessman.
Jed, no matter what anybody thought of him, good, bad or indifferent, they all said he was an amazing salesman. He could sell ice to an Eskimo.
Jed's talents earned him a good living and enabled him to buy a Victorian townhouse in the nearby town of Toobrook. But Jed hadn't let success go to his head.
He was a very, very pleasant, easygoing person.
He knew how to have a good time. He was also very successful. He just hadn't found the right person yet. It was in 1997 when Jed Gilbert met Ann Huxley.
Jed met Ann in a nightclub and they hit it off.
Jed was 41 when he met 32-year-old Ann. At first glance, they didn't have much in common and came from very different backgrounds.
Ann Huxley actually came from a part of Liverpool called Kensington, which is quite a lowly place, actually. It's quite a sort of poor working class area of Liverpool.
Unlike Jed, Ann had been married and divorced twice already.
She had a son and a daughter and lived in the Newsham Park area of Liverpool.
But they shared a strong work ethic. Ann was also an ambitious entrepreneur who operated a string of local businesses.
A brew spot, if you like, where officers could go and have a cup of coffee and one thing and another.
Ann Huxley was driven by money. She had in her mind some sort of glamorous lifestyle.
The two began dating. But while Jed was happy, his family wasn't.
Jed Gilbert's family, certainly his sister and mother, did not like Anne Huxley, and they didn't want him associating with her.
The relationship moved very fast. They had only dated for a year, and shortly thereafter, Anne moved into his townhome.
In 1998, Jed and Anne got married, but there were problems from the beginning.
Anne's marriage to Jed was certainly on the rocks and was coming to an end.
In 2002, after only 4 years of marriage, the couple divorced.
Albeit they were divorced, they were still living together in the same house, but in separate rooms.
However, the separation wouldn't last very long.
There had appeared to be some sort of reconciliation, and it looked to all intents and purposes that Anne was actually back in love with Jed and that she wanted to stay with him and make the marriage work.
But any hopes for a reconciliation are lost, now that Jed has been found brutally murdered.
That was the question on everyone's mind. I mean, why would anyone want to kill a man like Jed Gilbert?
Coming up, investigators dig beneath the surface of an estranged marriage and discover there is no shortage of suspects with a grudge against their victim.
Jed was a gambler, and by all accounts, not a very good one.
His gambling had gotten the best of him, had gotten so bad that he stole 11,000 pounds.
Police in Liverpool are investigating the brutal murder of Jed Gilbert, a 46-year-old salesman at the trading company where his body was found.
It was suspected he may have been killed with a shotgun.
Detectives recovered shotgun pellets from the ceiling, and closer inspection of the body seems to support their theory.
There was also a mark on the back of the neck, bruising, which was in the shape of the butt of a rifle or shotgun. Quite a substantial mark. We needed to do an inventory to see if anything was missing.
However, closer inspection of the crime scene suggests a different scenario.
There was no sign of a forced entry. The entry had been legitimate with a set of keys by the victim. The drawers hadn't been opened or anything like that.
And when the medical examiner moves the body, their suspicions are raised even further.
We found 2 pieces of latex which had appeared to come from a glove that had obviously ripped at some stage, and they had blood on. They were preserved and sent for analysis.
It looked like someone had tried to make the scene look like a robbery to cover up something more sinister.
In fact, it looked like the killers had come here for only one reason: to murder Jed Gilbert.
We thought that Mr. Gilbert had arrived for work at 9 o'clock and been followed in by the offenders, who probably had been lying in wait for him.
But why? While Jed's body was transported for an autopsy, investigators sit down with his ex-wife, Anne Huxley, who has just arrived on the scene.
Anne Huxley arrived at the premises searching for her husband, who she said hadn't been home all night. Huxley was what you would expect of a wife, really. Very, very emotional, upset, crying, couldn't understand why.
According to Anne, Jed went to the warehouse that day to handle a last-minute delivery. But when he didn't come home after work, Anne began to worry.
And Huxley was ringing neighbors, relatives, friends.
No one heard from Jed either. And so, of course, that really started to bother Anne. And after several hours, she started to fear the worst.
She thought perhaps he'd been in an accident, so she went to his place of work, looking for him, and that's how she arrived.
Detectives ask Anne if she can think of any reason why someone would want to harm Jed. To their surprise, she says yes.
Jed was a gambler, and by all accounts, not a very good one. And he did have debts, gambling-wise. She then said, well, he owed money to casinos.
In fact, it was Jed's gambling addiction that had caused them to divorce in the first place.
She was frightened the house was going to be repossessed to pay those debts off. So she divorced him so that he didn't have any say in the house.
She claimed that his gambling had gotten so bad that he stole 11,000 pounds from the shipping company. So his boss, Steve Canavan, might be someone they should look at as a suspect.
He was questioned quite seriously from the start because there's quite often somebody who reports the body is the person who's committed the crime.
Investigators can't rule out the possibility Jed's boss was involved. And Anne isn't finished with her list of possible enemies yet.
So after the divorce, Anne started dating another man by the name of Paul Gunning. But here's the thing. She and Jed were still living together, and Gunning didn't like that at all.
He obviously thought it was going somewhere. It wasn't.
Anne says she broke off the affair with Paul Gunning, but he wouldn't leave her alone.
Anne said it had gotten so bad that she decided to take a drastic action. She apparently asked a friend to kind of rough up Paul Gunning so that he could stop harassing her.
She actually gave us his name, Pauline.
Detectives now find themselves with a host of potential suspects.
Maybe he owed money to the wrong people. Maybe there was some sort of argument. He'd stolen money from his employers. Or maybe this was a jealous lover who had just decided to get rid of the husband.
While police consider the possibilities, the autopsy report comes in. The medical examiner has determined the cause of death, and it's not what they expected.
There was no evidence whatsoever of a firearm being used. It was sheer blunt trauma and vastly in excess of what was needed to kill somebody. Every bone in his skull had been fractured or basically obliterated. Such was the force to the head. He'd a gaping hole over his left eyebrow.
The damage is too severe to have been caused by the butt of a rifle. And when police finish their inventory of the warehouse, they make an interesting discovery.
There was a fire extinguisher missing, which was quite unusual. You don't break into a warehouse to steal a fire extinguisher. It was obviously significant.
Coming up, the investigation hits one roadblock after another.
Not one single lead panned out.
Until a new suspect drops a bombshell.
He had been in a relationship with Anne Huxley.
In Huyton, England, detectives are slowly unraveling the mystery surrounding the brutal murder of 46-year-old Jed Gilbert.
So when the autopsy revealed that the injuries were caused by blunt force trauma, the investigators realized that it might have been due to a missing fire extinguisher and that the suspect potentially took the fire extinguisher from the crime scene.
Jed's ex-wife, Anne Huxley, thought his gambling addiction may have earned him a few dangerous enemies.
Police looked into the casinos Jed had visited, but couldn't come up with any leads.
Neither the casino owners nor their debt collectors could be linked to the killing.
These were avenues that we did explore, and they came to nothing.
Police turned their attention to a second suspect, Jed's boss at the trading company, Stephen Canavan.
Anne told investigators that Jed had taken 11,000 pounds from the shipping company, implying that the owner, Steve Canavan, might have had a motive to get rid of Jed, to get rid of a problem employee.
Steve Canavan vehemently denied this.
According to Canavan, he made Jed pay back the stolen money by taking it out of his pay.
At the time of the murder, he had actually paid back £5,000.
Canavan insists he had no reason to hurt Jed. Despite the gambling problem, Jed was his most valuable employee.
Without him, he didn't have a company because he was such an outstanding salesman. He said he just couldn't replace him.
Steve Canavan's alibi checked out. The 24 hours prior to the body being found, there was nothing to suggest he was responsible.
With Canavan eliminated as a suspect, investigators take a look at another man implicated by Anne Huxley, her ex-lover, Paul Gunning.
She named him as somebody who was wanting to remove Gilbert so he could take the place.
In his interview with detectives, Gunning denies having anything to do with Jed's murder.
Paul Gunning was completely forthcoming with the police. He admitted the affair with Ann, but he said he was over it and had absolutely no motive to injure Jed.
Paul Gunning has got a cast iron alibi. He can account for all of his movements around the time and around the days of Jed Gilbert's death.
While police can find nothing to link Gunning to the murder, his business dealings with Ann Huxley are of interest to them.
So Paul Gunning owned a company, an escort company called 2020. Now, on one hand, these types of escort companies may simply be for the partnership, the companionship of a woman, but it can also be used as cover.
And according to Gunning, when he met Ann a few years earlier, she wanted a piece of the action.
Huxley applied for a job there and then ended up taking it over from him.
It seems Ann's chain of shops were actually just a clever front for a growing escort business.
Ann Huxley had a history of working in escort agencies throughout the city.
Girls would go out and work for her, and she was actually getting paid some money for that. It wasn't a sort of brothel that she was running from her home. It was more that she was taking a cut of what the girls would actually get paid when they were going out, carrying out sex work.
It was a far cry from the simple entrepreneur Ann claimed to be. And police were in for another surprise when they tracked down Ann's friend, Paul Eaton, the man who she'd asked to rough up Gunning.
Eaton was a nightclub doorman who worked in Birkenhead, which is just across the river from Liverpool.
Huxley met him when she was looking for premises to open escort agencies over in Birkenhead, and they struck up a friendship.
According to Eaton, he and Ann were much more than just friends.
It didn't take Paul Eaton long to admit that he had been in a relationship with Ann Huxley.
Eaton told police that he was in love with Ann and that they'd been on a trip to South Africa together, and it was Paul's impression that was a love that was going to last.
Eaton says the trip had inspired them to take their relationship to the next level.
During this holiday to South Africa, Paul Eaton had in fact proposed to Ann Huxley, and they got engaged.
Paul Eaton had an obsession with Ann Huxley, a deep love for her maybe. So that could certainly be a motivation for murder. As she'd stated with Paul Gunning in the past, perhaps it was the case that his jealousy of the close relationship that she still had with Jed Gilbert had motivated him to kill.
But Eaton claimed he had no reason to be jealous, since Ann had accepted his proposal.
When police spoke to Paul Eaton, he denied any involvement at all.
However, his alibi doesn't hold up quite as well as their other suspects.
He gave us a convoluted story about his mother or a relative being ill and phoning his friend Paul Lewis, getting in a car, driving on the motorway to Wales to discuss his sorrow. The car not sounding too well, so they turned around and came back to Birken. They went for a drink in a nightclub. When he came back to the car, it wouldn't start. It was a real nonsense tale, really. When you listened to it, you thought, who in the right mind would produce this as an alibi?
So they tracked down Eaton's friend Lewis to see what he has to say.
They were both doormen, worked on the doors in Birkenhead. That's how they knew each other.
Lewis tells police the same story, although it doesn't ring true. It's not proof of any foul play. However, investigators are curious about one thing.
If Ann Huxley was prepared to lie about her relationship with Paul Eaton, well, what else is she prepared to lie about?
Coming up, a closer look at the grieving ex-wife finally gives detectives the break they've been searching for.
Why was his phone in Page Moss, which is the next district where the victim was murdered?
Those phone records were pretty damning evidence.
A few weeks into the investigation of Jed Gilbert's brutal murder, Liverpool police have a lot of suspicions, but no hard evidence.
Investigators had a pair of alibis from Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis, but they seemed completely implausible. Eaton had also revealed that he and Anne Huxley were engaged to be married.
There were so many levels to this murder.
If Anne Huxley was involved in a serious relationship with another man, why hadn't she mentioned that in her interview?
According to Anne, she and Jed were trying to reconcile, and she only mentioned Eaton as a friend who kind of helped her. So, what was really going on?
Investigators take a closer look at Anne's story and where she said she'd been the night Jed was murdered.
She'd gone out to a sunbed centre. She went to her sister's, her mother's, visited various relatives.
Anne told them she made a flurry of calls looking for Jed when he failed to come home from work.
When we checked Huxley's phone, all the people she'd contacted were there, the police, the ambulance, and everybody else.
But when investigators study the records further, something else jumps out.
Anne's phone records show that she called someone else, someone she had no business calling, if she was looking for her missing husband.
Significantly, amongst those was a phone call to Paul Eaton.
And a call to her new fiancé isn't all they discover.
You start delving deeper into the phone calls, the movements of the vehicles, and they become significant.
Anne's calls to Eaton had been made around the time he claimed he was on the way to Wales. But cell tower activity indicates he was somewhere else.
Why was his phone in Page Moss, which is the next district to Highton, where the victim was murdered? So we looked at that, and then we looked at the story that Paul Eaton had given us of where he was and his movements on the night. And obviously, he'd lied to us. He'd been over in Highton at the time, round about midnight, the time of the murder.
Those phone records were pretty damning evidence, and not just against Paul Eaton. So, what was Anne Huxley's real role in all of this?
We first started looking seriously at Eaton, and then obviously we had to start looking at Huxley.
According to Anne, in early 2002, Jed's gambling caused her to divorce him to keep from losing their home, but they were trying to work things out. But when investigators talk to Jed's family, they paint an entirely different picture.
They said that Jed's gambling didn't make Anne afraid. In fact, it just made her really mad. There was no reconciliation.
From talking to members of the family and relatives, she'd had enough of him. She just divorced him.
According to relatives, Anne had only continued to live with Jed because she needed his money.
He paid £150 a week rent. So basically, he was just keeping the roof over the head.
So relatives said that after the divorce, Jed and Anne slept in separate bedrooms, and Anne had her own occasional male visitors.
To quote friends of Gilbert's, she basically treated him like a doormat.
This had continued for over 6 months, right up to Jed's death. And one of the boyfriends they name is Anne's now fiancé, Paul Eaton.
She brought Paul Eaton back to the house while Gilbert was there. I mean, it just defies description, really.
However, one of Jed's friends tells police that in the summer of 2002, he had dinner with Jed and Anne.
He said he couldn't believe the transformation. Suddenly, she was all over him and was fawning all over him and saying, oh, yes, we're back in love and we're going to remarry.
If we believe Paul Eaton that he and Anne Huxley are engaged, why is she trying to get back together with her ex-husband, Jed Gilbert?
When detectives check the couple's finances, they uncover some suspicious behavior in the weeks leading up to Jed's death.
She suddenly arrives at an insurance agent's, takes a £400,000 life insurance cover over the two of them, and if one of them passes away, suddenly the other one gets $400,000. She then goes to a solicitor, has wills drawn up where he signs everything over to her, lock, stock and barrel. And that was in the August. And then 6 weeks later, he's murdered.
To detectives, Anne looks like a bitter divorcee who lured her ex-husband into a deadly trap to collect on his life insurance. Their suspicion grows after some of Eaton's friends describe Anne's behavior when they returned from their trip to Africa.
When they came back, she was sporting an engagement ring, which she was showing everybody in the nightclubs in Birkenhead.
Investigators follow up with the owner of the club in Birkenhead. He remembers Eaton and his friend Lewis coming in after the murder, and they brought something rather strange.
They had a fire extinguisher with them, and the adjoining premises was a galvanising factory, and they had vats of acid, and they went over the fence and threw the fire extinguisher into one of the vats.
There's too much of a coincidence. That had to be the missing fire extinguisher. And if it were, then of course you would try to destroy it because it could be the murder weapon.
Police contact the factory and have the vats drained.
We actually recovered the fire extinguisher from the vat. It hadn't been destroyed. It had been damaged severely, but it hadn't been destroyed.
That's a major breakthrough in the case. If they can prove that the fire extinguisher was used to kill Jed Gilbert, that puts Eaton and Lewis in possession of the murder weapon.
Test results from the bloody latex found underneath Jed's body provide further evidence against the pair.
The 2 pieces of latex was confirmed that they'd come from a glove.
The pieces of latex were examined, and they had the DNA of Paul Lewis on them.
It wasn't a massive amount, but it was enough to say that Lewis had worn those gloves and was at the crime scene and must have been involved in the murder.
Coming up, a suspect cracks and a new witness comes forward.
The pair of them set about beating Jed Gilbert to death.
Two months after the murder of Jed Gilbert, police believe they have a solid case against Ann Huxley's fiancé, Paul Eaton, and his friend, Paul Lewis.
All these things were coming together, which put them very, very firmly in the frame as suspects.
But detectives are convinced Ann played a role as well.
Ann Huxley admitted to using Eaton to beat up another ex-lover. So you have to wonder, has she orchestrated another attack, but this time to get rid of her husband?
The question is, can they prove it? On December 16th, 2002, 6 weeks after Jed's murder, Eaton and Lewis are arrested and brought in for interrogation. Eaton is the first to crack.
He admitted to going to the premises, but he went there merely to warn Gilbert of pestering Huxley because she wanted no more to do with him. And he was a boyfriend. He was taking over.
Eaton was hopelessly infatuated with Ann Huxley, and he had said he had gone to tell him to stay away from her.
According to Eaton, Jed reacted violently, pulling out a shotgun. Eaton claims he had no choice but to fight back.
They wrestled and it went off. And he then hit him with a fire extinguisher.
It wasn't exactly self-defense because he was trespassing, but Eaton is making it sound as though it was all heat of the moment and that it's not his fault.
Meanwhile, police are questioning Lewis in another room. He tells a similar story.
Lewis said he waited in the car outside, heard noises, shouting and a bang, and went inside and saw the victim on the floor and Eaton hitting him with a fire extinguisher.
If you hit someone in the head with a fire extinguisher, they're going to stay down. So why continue to hit them?
It was just a nonsense tale. We managed to disprove everything that they said. We went through the DNA in the latex gloves. No answer for that. Didn't know what to say.
Eaton and Lewis also failed to mention Ann Huxley. So the next day, investigators decide to bring her in as well.
So Ann keeps repeating the same thing that she had already given to the investigators. She's just a grieving widow, and there's no reason for them to suspect that she'll be involved in the murder.
Huxley basically said she knew nothing about it. He was going there for a business deal, and she stuck to that.
Detectives want to know why Ann didn't tell them about her engagement to Eaton, or the life insurance she'd taken out on her estranged husband weeks before he was murdered.
How does she explain having a £400,000 insurance policy taken out 6 or 7 weeks prior to his death, and making a new will and signing everything over to her? And as you've realised from what I've been saying, she orchestrated everything. Without her, there wouldn't have been a murder.
Anne denied absolutely any involvement in it and said that, you know, it must have been Paul Eaton who was so infatuated with her. He had taken matters into his own hands without any conspiracy from her, without any instigation from her. He had simply become a jealous lover.
Investigators aren't convinced, but her accusations seem to be supported by one of Eaton's friends, who comes forward with new testimony against him.
The witness said that Eaton told her he went to the warehouse intending on shooting Jed with a sawed-off shotgun. But at the last minute, he just couldn't do it.
Eaton is not a tough guy. From what we've learned about Eaton, we don't think he had the guts or fortitude to do that.
The witness says that Eaton told her Jed was the one who grabbed the gun. And as the two men struggled, Lewis came inside to help.
It was Paul Lewis that actually went and got the fire extinguisher from its holder on the wall. And then the pair of them set about beating Jed Gilbert to death.
Eaton's friend asked Paul why he did it, and he said he just did it for the money.
She promised Eaton and Lewis £100,000 between them for committing the murder.
Her testimony not only gives police enough to charge Eaton and Lewis, it verifies their suspicions that Ann was behind the plot to kill her ex-husband.
This is the same woman who's already admitted that she's already manipulated Eaton into committing another attack. She knew that he was madly in love with her, infatuated with her, so prepared to do almost anything for her.
She was nicknamed at the end of the inquiry the Black Widow.
Anne Huxley was considered by police to be the instigator of this, and she was charged with conspiracy to commit murder.
Eaton and Lewis were both charged with the murder of Gerald Gilbert.
Coming up, as the trial gets underway, one of the defendants makes a dramatic announcement.
I knew this was going to thrust the whole trial into chaos.
After days of interrogation, Liverpool police have charged 3 co-conspirators with the murder of 46-year-old Jed Gilbert, his ex-wife Ann Huxley, her lover Paul Eaton, and his friend Paul Lewis. In April of 2004, the trial begins.
When Ann Huxley was in court, she tried hard to present herself dress-wise as middle-aged housewife, and that was the image she tried to project in court. She didn't succeed.
The prosecution paints Ann as a vengeful black widow. Angered by her husband's gambling debts, she divorced him, only to plot a deadly scheme to get rich.
She was going to stop at nothing to make sure that she got that £400,000 in her hands at some stage.
She promised Eaton and Lewis £100,000 between them for committing the murder.
They have witness testimony from a friend of Eaton's who says he told her all about this plot to kill Jed Gilbert.
Prosecutors also call another friend of Eaton's to the stand. He testifies that he drove Eaton and Lewis to the warehouse that night thinking they were repossessing a car.
Now, he thought nothing of this because Lewis and Eaton had in the past repossessed cars for insurance companies.
He said the 2 men told him to park nearby and just wait for the call. Fortunately, he parked near a cell tower.
About 20 minutes later, he received a phone call from Eaton and Lewis saying, "Come and pick us up."
He says that when Eaton and Lewis got back in the car, however, he realized he'd been duped.
He couldn't remember which one had the blood on the shoes, but one of them did, and they were referring to having beaten somebody up or assaulted somebody.
The gun was dumped in the River Mersey on the way back from an attack. Police have never found that gun.
Since Eaton is the one charged with the actual murder, he is the first to present his defense.
It was obvious that something quite dramatic was going to unfold.
Eaton's defence barrister stood up and said he wanted to change his plea to guilty.
He had taken a sawn-off shotgun along with him, and he had taken it there just to threaten Jed.
The consequences for Paul Eaton were massive. If you admit to murder in England and Wales, you automatically get a life sentence.
So the real question here is, why did Eaton confess? Some believe that he knew he was in too deep and he was going away anyway. Others think that he was trying to protect Anne.
This was a woman who he was actually deeply, deeply in love with. I think the thought, actually, of having to stand up in court and drop her in a whole lot of trouble was just too much for him to bear.
However, Anne doesn't repay Eaton's loyalty when it's her turn to take the stand.
She was happy to give the impression that Paul must have taken matters into his own hands, and she had sort of said that he must have been a jealous lover and he had decided to attack Jed of his own volition.
Anne claims that she'd broken off her affair with Eaton to reconcile with Jed. And as far as Jed's life insurance policy was concerned, she says it was taken out in her children's best interests.
She's still trying to portray herself as the mother, the grieving widow, not a criminal mastermind. And yet this is a woman who's had multiple affairs, but more importantly, runs 5 different escort agencies.
It was the Anne Huxley Roadshow, let's put it like that. Here I am, the star of the performance. Here's my performance.
When Lewis testifies, he also tries to pin the murder on Eaton.
Lewis just said yes, he was there, he was sat in the car, it was Eaton who went in, it was Eaton who committed the murder.
But prosecutors argue that the evidence suggests otherwise.
I believe it was Lewis, not Eaton, who picked the fire extinguisher up and just crashed it down on the victim's head. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly.
The jury believes it too, finding Paul Lewis guilty of murder and Anne Huxley guilty of conspiracy.
They all said, to a T, we saw through her explanations and her story, and everything that she was giving was so false.
Eaton and Lewis were both sentenced to life imprisonment, and Anne Huxley was given 20 years.
Jed's killers had been brought to justice. However, many believed Anne had gotten off too lightly. To them, she would always be the Black Widow who'd seduced 3 men to their doom.
She's not only manipulated this, her poor ex-husband who's died, but then manipulated these other 2 people to help her achieve her end goal.
Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis were not master criminals. They were just kind of ordinary guys, and they'd just become embroiled in this absolutely hideous situation because of her. She was the malevolent mastermind behind all this, and if it wasn't for her, Jed Gilbert would still be alive today.
Need.
He lavished her with expensive gifts, everything that a girl could want. Everything seemed to be absolutely perfect between them.
He just fell head over heels in love with her.
But beneath this life of luxury, dark secrets are waiting to be exposed.
At some stage, he realised there was something more going on.
She started using alcohol and drugs in quite large proportions.
There was concern as to whether or not she'd harmed herself. There was concern as to whether she was still alive.
And when an act of betrayal pushes one lover to the brink, detectives find themselves in a race against time.
This wasn't a momentary feeling, it was an orchestrated execution.
On January 12, 2016, at 8:14 p.m., Welsh police receive a panicked phone call from Alexi Butcher, a local woman who says her best friend, 25-year-old Georgina Simmons, has gone missing.
Georgina was meant to pick up her daughter from school, and the alarm bells were raised when she didn't.
It had been 5 hours since Georgina failed to pick up her daughter. Police are dispatched to her home address, a bungalow near Pencoed Castle in Newport, South Wales.
When police arrive, they're met by Alexi, Georgina's boyfriend of 3 years, Peter Morgan, and her mother.
Georgina's friends and family were really concerned because nobody was able to reach her, and yet everything had seemed fine that morning. And Georgina had made plans with Alexi.
The arrangement was that after pickup, the two of them would meet with their children and go on to entertain them at some point in the early evening. What happened was that at the end of the school day, no one came to collect Georgina's daughter.
Georgina's car was still in the driveway, and police find no signs of a break-in.
When the police get to Georgina's and look around the house, it's clear that there hasn't actually been a break-in. But this is really concerning because her friends know that she wouldn't simply disappear.
Georgina Simmons had grown up in the seaside town of Newport, Pembrokeshire.
Newport is a university and cathedral city in the southeast of Wales. Parts of it are very affluent, very nice areas. So it blends town and country.
She came from a modest background. Her parents separated when she was quite young. She had other siblings.
Georgina was very bright, very bubbly, quite ambitious. Her friends described her as one of a kind. She seemed very popular. Mother said she was extremely happy. So certainly as a young person, she was full of life.
She eventually formed a relationship with a man called Peter Dean, with whom she had a young child. Like many relationships, it started well, and then things tailed off. It was described as an on-off relationship.
Since she and Dean had no plans to get married, Georgina took on a series of odd jobs in order to provide for her daughter.
Georgina Simmons was a beautician and I think she worked in a call centre as well.
Thereafter, she moved to become a burlesque dancer, then a stripper, and ultimately an escort.
Georgina's career may have been an unconventional one, but it was also one that brought in a great deal of money for her daughter, and as a committed mother, that was her priority.
But her life would change in 2012, when the 22-year-old escort met a lonely 50-year-old millionaire named Peter Morgan.
Peter was a very successful, very well-known local businessman. He'd diversified from the family farming business, initially into farm buildings, then into property development, and pretty much everything that he touched turned to gold. It's estimated he was worth around about £20 million.
He comes from a well-respected family based in the Usk Valley in South Wales. He was married for about 20 years. They had 2 daughters of late teenage, early 20s age.
As far as everyone was concerned, they were the perfect family.
But Peter's marriage wasn't as perfect as it appeared to be.
Peter had what he described as a midlife crisis and went a little off the rails. He collected cars. He bought a tank. He collected motorbikes.
He learned that he could find escorts on the internet. There was no strings attached. He would make a small payment, have an arrangement, and then leave.
It was only a matter of time before Peter and Georgina's worlds collided.
Peter was using an escort service, one a month, and met Georgina that way, and he took a shine to her.
Their initial relationship was purely commercial, she providing sexual services, he providing payment for such services.
As their relationship carried on, he became more and more obsessed with her.
Peter's wife eventually found out what he was up to.
On Valentine's Day 2013, she discovered he sent flowers to another woman, and this led to a marriage breakdown, and he separated from his wife.
Peter and Georgina started to spend more time together, not only as a couple, but also with Georgina's daughter. That allowed their relationship to develop.
It's a fairy tale romance between Peter and Georgina. Everything a girl could want, you know. Expensive cars, spa days, helicopter flights from his castle. What more? It's the stuff of a movie.
Peter's financial support also meant Georgina didn't have to worry quite as much about her 5-year-old daughter anymore. He moved them into the bungalow by the castle that he owned, just a few miles down the road from his home.
He allowed her to live rent-free while also paying her between, I think, £7,000 and £10,000 a month for exclusivity.
Peter Morgan would often stay with her as if they were a family unit.
While their relationship was unconventional, it seemed to be the perfect arrangement. In early 2016, Peter and Georgina hit their 3-year anniversary.
Peter felt, undoubtedly, that Georgina was the one. I think he referred to her as his soulmate, and he definitely felt that she was going to be the love of his life.
Now, detectives are struggling to explain her sudden disappearance.
No one relating anything to those officers investigating said they knew where Georgina was.
The police certainly took this seriously and put a team together fairly quickly.
In any missing persons case, the first 24 hours are crucial, and the clock is already ticking. Coming up, a loved one's revelation takes the case in a new direction.
Emotionally, she was in an unstable and difficult place.
He was worried that maybe one day he wouldn't be around and she might just snap and do something really drastic.
Police in Newport, Wales are investigating the disappearance of 25-year-old Georgina Simmons. Georgina's friend Alexi tells police everything seemed fine when they spoke earlier that day.
Alexi described her as being her usual bubbly self.
They'd scheduled a play date between their kids, nothing out of the ordinary there. But when Georgina didn't show up, the school tried to contact her.
A telephone call was made to her mother and also to her friend Alexi to try and ascertain what had happened. As a result of those telephone calls from the school, the whole inquiry as to where Georgina was put in train. And until that point, nobody knew that she was missing.
Alexi obviously was very concerned about where her friend was, so she contacted Peter to see if Georgina was with him.
Peter said that he'd been ringing the phone all morning, trying to get a reply.
Georgina wasn't answering the phone to either of them.
No one has seen Georgina since just before noon, and her mother tells police she's especially concerned because of something Peter told her that morning.
Georgina's mother gets a phone call from a distressed Peter. He claims that he's been at Georgina's bungalow, she's been drinking heavily. Georgina's mother reassures Peter and just suggests that Georgina's having a bad day and suggests giving her a bit of space to get over it.
When they still hadn't heard from Georgina by 5 p.m., Alexi met Peter at the bungalow to look for her.
They searched the cottage to no avail. At that point, there was no sign of Georgina anywhere.
Georgina's vehicle was still in the vicinity of the bungalow. This led those looking for her to believe she had gone somewhere on foot.
They eventually decided that they'd searched enough and that there was no sign of her, so Alexi decided to contact the police at around 8:14 in the evening.
So far, detectives have found no sign of foul play, but they're interested to know more about Georgina's state of mind that morning.
Peter suggests that in recent times, Georgina's been acting very distant towards him and behaving strangely. And essentially, not only has she asked him to leave, she suggested that she wants the relationship to end.
Peter Morgan raised concerns to the police as to whether or not she was mentally stable. This, of course, was contrary to what Alexi Butcher had appreciated, having spoken to her earlier that morning.
Peter appears really distressed and very concerned, suggesting that whilst everybody else might have thought that Georgina was quite happy, he knew that she was actually very upset.
Peter tells police that when they met, Georgina was a beautiful and vivacious young woman. But over the past year, she'd turned into a completely different person. And the origin of Georgina's strange transformation could be traced to two tragic events.
He tells them that in the past 10 months, Georgina has had some really significant losses, both her father and also the father of her child, and that sent her on a downward spiral.
Things were very, very difficult for her. She started using alcohol and drugs in quite large proportions.
Things may not have been great with Peter Dean, who was the father of Georgina's child, but nonetheless, losing him absolutely broke her heart.
Georgina's use of drink and drugs initially seemed to be a bit of a coping mechanism for what was going on in her life, but that started to spiral, and in particular her use of cocaine became a real worry for those around her.
It was possible at this stage that Georgina's despair had got the better of her.
In fact, Peter worries that depression might have finally pushed Georgina to kill herself.
Georgina had previously attempted suicide on 2 occasions. She'd taken an overdose, and Peter had taken her to hospital after that.
Both of these situations really worried Peter, so he was keeping a close eye on her. He worried that perhaps one day when he wasn't around, she might snap and do something really drastic. And there was also her little girl to bear in mind.
According to Peter, he'd been by the bungalow that morning, but they'd had an argument, and Georgina had kicked him out. Was it possible she wanted to make sure he didn't stop her this time?
There was real concern as to Georgina's well-being, as to whether or not she'd harmed herself. There was concern as to whether she was still alive.
Peter tells detectives that if Georgina did intend to commit suicide, the woods behind the castle were the most likely place she'd do it.
Peter pointed out a tree that he said Georgina had previously said she would use to hang herself when she was in one of her depressive spells.
Georgina had expressed at times of stress that that's the sort of place she would go if she wanted to harm herself.
As well as the cottage, they also looked in nearby woodland to see if Georgina was there, where he said Georgina had more than once threatened to hang herself from. The search was very much to no avail, no sign of Georgina anywhere.
The search for Georgina Simmons quickly turns into a nationwide manhunt.
Georgina was treated by the police as a high-risk missing person because of her mental state and what Peter and the family had told her.
But when police finally locate her, will she be alive or dead? Coming up, investigators uncover yet another layer to Georgina's troubled past.
In the end, she made a decision, but this led to tragic consequences.
This had an enormous effect on Georgina. Many people wondered if she felt responsible for Peter's death.
Newport, Wales detectives are desperately searching for 25-year-old Georgina Simmons. After speaking to her loved ones, they believe she may be suicidal and are racing to find her before it's too late.
Their thinking was the fact that she was in a state of emotional distress. She had made an attempt on her own life already, and it may have been that this was what they were looking at.
To help locate Georgina, investigators try using the GPS feature on her cell phone.
They discovered that around about noon on that day, the phone had been in the Usk area, which is probably about 20 minutes away from where Georgina lives, but is also where Peter's ex-wife Helen lived.
Now, that threw police a bit of a curve. Because if Georgina was planning to kill herself, why visit Peter's ex-wife?
Peter explains that Georgina had been asking him to sign over ownership of the bungalow where she and her daughter lived. But there was a problem.
The bungalow was in fact owned by a company which Peter Morgan was a director of, together with his estranged wife, so it would have required her consent.
Peter suggested that Georgina might have gone over to his ex's to confront her and to get her to change her mind.
When detectives try to contact Peter's ex-wife, however, they learn she is out of the country.
The idea that Georgina had been to see Helen, that theory fell apart very quickly because Helen was actually on holiday with her children and not at home.
But that was the last place Georgina's phone had been used. So they dig further into her past, hoping to find a lead, starting with her relationship with her deceased ex, Peter Deem.
Peter Deem was described as the love of her life. They had a child together and seemed very happy.
When she decided to become an escort, Peter Deem really struggled with this, and it caused a great many arguments in their relationship, to the point where Georgina suggested maybe they could have an open relationship, but that simply led to more fights.
Georgina's relationship with Deem became even more complicated in August of 2012, when she met Peter Morgan.
Peter Morgan started as a client relationship, but over time it seems that this became more romantic. We're not sure how much Peter Deem knew about that, but certainly her close friends were aware of both of those men.
Amongst her friends, Georgina referred to Poor Pete and Rich Pete.
And when Georgina agreed to be exclusive with Peter Morgan, the situation only got worse.
Pete Deem found that very, very difficult to cope with.
It was clear that Georgina recognised both the men in her life had some very deep feelings towards her, and it became more difficult to have a relationship with both of them.
In August of 2015, Georgina told Peter Morgan that she'd broken up with her ex.
He allowed her to live rent-free in the bungalow that he owned next door to his castle.
However, despite seeing Peter Deem several times in secret, ultimately she made the decision to be with Rich Pete, and we understand that this broke Peter Deem's heart.
In November 2015, Peter Deem hung himself.
Her friends and family worried that she felt responsible for his death, that her choice to be with Peter Morgan had resulted in his suicide. She started taking drugs and drinking heavily, and with a daughter around, Peter felt that he needed to call social services.
Georgina Simmons threatened Peter Morgan and said that she would take her own life if social services took away her daughter.
The story related by Georgina's family and friends seems to support Peter's assumption that she'd made good on her threats. But that's about to change.
So Peter's explaining to detectives how he's constantly trying to get Georgina to stop using. But then, in the middle of his statement, he says something strange.
Peter admitted to police that he took Georgina's phone to stop her contacting anyone to buy drugs.
That immediately raised suspicions for the police because he'd initially told them that she wasn't answering any calls. He then told them that he had her phone. And obviously it's fairly quick to work out why she wasn't answering calls if her phone was in his possession.
He led the police to the phone, which was in the front seat of his car.
That obviously changes the situation a bit, and there are a lot of questions he needs to answer, and none of it looks good.
After Peter handed over the phone, he travelled with police to Maindee Police Station to continue the investigation.
Detectives want to know why Peter failed to mention the phone in his initial statement.
That's a very strange thing to lie about, especially when the cell phone belongs to the person who's missing.
Peter Morgan's reaction was to shrug and say words to the effect he wanted to give the impression to the others who were concerned for Georgina's welfare that he was making an effort in trying to look for her.
If they weren't suspicious before, then they have to be now. Basically, he's saying that he was just going through the motions while looking for Georgina. And the only reason for that is that he already knows where she is.
The suggestion by Peter Morgan that Georgina had gone to confront his estranged wife was in fact nonsense, because he knew his estranged wife was not in the country at that time, having gone on holiday.
So Georgina had never gone over to his ex-wife's house, so she couldn't have left her phone there. Peter had had her phone the whole time, so it must have been him who'd gone over to his ex-wife's house when she wasn't there. The big question was why?
Coming up, the search for Georgina Simmons finally comes to an end.
This missing persons case turned into a full-on murder investigation.
Detectives have been questioning multimillionaire Peter Morgan in the disappearance of his live-in girlfriend, Georgina Simmons. And his contradictory statements have raised their suspicions.
At the station, the police start to apply pressure.
Even though it was the middle of the night, the police did not stop. They knew Peter knew something more than he was telling them about Georgina's whereabouts.
As the hours rolled on, that became tougher and tougher for him, and there were more and more questions.
So far, Peter isn't talking, but investigators have other sources of information.
While the police were talking to Peter, they were at the same time talking further to Georgina's family and friends and learning more about the relationship between Georgina and Peter.
Those investigations by the police revealed that the relationship between Peter Morgan and Georgina Simmons was not a two-way thing in the way he envisaged.
He was absolutely smitten with Georgina, very much in love. What became clear from talking to Georgina's family and friends was that actually Georgina didn't feel that way at all.
She was only with him for the money. The relationship was very one-sided.
The family sort of spoke about times where she had belittled him in front of them. So it became quite apparent that her affections weren't as strong as his.
For Georgina, her relationship with Peter remained a business transaction. Georgina recognised that Peter was an individual who could look after her financially, and she stretched that relationship as far as she could.
Georgina had confided, particularly in Alexei Butcher, that her relationship with Peter Morgan was not a long-term thing. Her plans were to be elsewhere, to start a new chapter in her life. She was going to get what she could financially in order to support herself and her daughter, and then move on and cast aside Peter Morgan.
And those plans may have included going back to her ex-boyfriend, Peter Dean.
Her extreme reaction to Dean's suicide clearly indicated her feelings for him were a lot stronger than the ones she had for Peter Morgan.
Was that the reason why she kicked Peter out of the bungalow the morning she disappeared?
Georgina Simmons blamed Peter Morgan for her ex-boyfriend Peter Dean's death, wishing that it had been Peter Morgan, not Peter Dean, that had died.
At one point, she actually told a friend, "I love a dead man," which demonstrates the power of her feeling towards Peter Dean.
This was a long way away from being a perfect relationship, and that became the real focus of the investigation.
Armed with this information, detectives turn up the pressure on Peter Morgan. And around 4:45 a.m. on January 13th, nearly 14 hours after Georgina's disappearance, Peter finally cracks.
Peter eventually told the police that he couldn't take it anymore, that he needed to tell them the truth.
He made an unsolicited comment, words to the effect of, "I can't take it. I strangled her this morning. I loved her so much."
Whilst the police knew that Peter was hiding something, his confession was still shocking and unexpected. It appears that the pressure got too much for him.
He didn't think what was going to happen after. He just assumed that she would be accepted, that she was missing, that they'd accept that she'd gone off somewhere and killed herself. So he hadn't thought any further.
The seriousness of what he had done and the scale of what he had done was weighing too much upon him.
Peter's confession changes everything.
Suddenly, this missing persons case had turned into a full-blown murder investigation.
As part of his admission, Peter led police to where he had hidden Georgina's body.
At 6 a.m. on January 13th, detectives arrive at the farmhouse owned by Peter's ex-wife.
Why on earth you'd put the body of your girlfriend into the boot of your car and then drive it to your ex-wife's house is just really odd.
They found Georgina's body hidden behind, I think, a saw or a piece of farming equipment.
The body had been wrapped in black plastic, tied with rope, secured to a pole, and the orange baling twine that Peter had used to strangle Georgina with was still in place around her neck.
It was also unthinkable. I mean, this was meant to be the woman he loved, and yet he just discarded her like a piece of trash.
Investigators also discover another piece of evidence Peter tried to dispose of.
When the package containing Georgina's body was opened, the police noticed that she wasn't wearing any footwear. In the near vicinity, a black plastic bag was found. Contained within it were personal items.
Georgina's handbag, her house keys, her car keys, and some high-heeled boots.
And another item which became of great interest to the police, what looked like a three-way plug adapter.
On closer inspection of the plug, it proved to be actually a listening device, which could be plumbed into a mobile phone.
It seemed Peter had been spying on Georgina, but for what purpose?
That very quickly became the main focus of the investigation.
Coming up, detectives uncover the startling circumstances leading up to Georgina's death.
He felt that there was something duplicitous potentially happening, and he wanted to have first vision of that.
He listened in to Georgina more than 500 times in less than 2 months.
Peter Morgan has just confessed to the murder of his girlfriend, Georgina Simmons. What police don't yet understand is why. They hope a listening device found near her body might help explain his motive.
This plug adapter contained a SIM card and a microphone, so you're able to dial into the listening device. Once you've dialed in, you can hear everything that's going on in that room.
That listening device had been secreted by Peter Morgan into the bungalow at Pencoed Castle, so he was able to hear what was going on with Georgina's private life.
The fact that Peter Morgan was spying on Georgina demonstrated that he wouldn't have been able to trust her, and the police wanted him to explain why.
If investigators were hoping for another confession, however, they were disappointed.
Peter Morgan told the police that he had placed that listening device at Pencoed Bungalow in order that he could monitor her well-being. He said he had real concerns as to whether or not she would harm herself.
He was afraid that her drug abuse was spiraling out of control, and he wanted to monitor any phone calls to her dealers.
But for whatever reason, he goes back to his original story and makes it seem like he has a perfectly good explanation for why he's spying on Georgina. But when police take a look at his contacts, they realize he's lying.
In order to disguise the nefarious use he had for this number, Peter Morgan put the number for the listening device in his phone as Isabel.
Police obtained Peter's cell phone records, which reveal the full extent of his surveillance.
It was established that between November 2015 and early January 2016, Peter Morgan had accessed the listening device no less than 514 times, often spending hours upon end listening to what was going on at Pencoed Bungalow.
Peter undoubtedly heard a lot of stuff that he shouldn't have, including her plans to take his bungalow, to get that signed over to her, and her overall intent to drop him as soon as she got what she wanted.
During the period from the 10th to the 11th of January 2016, Peter Morgan was accessing the Isabel listening device almost full-time.
When confronted with the evidence, Peter finally admits to spying on Georgina. He'd suspected for some time that she was using him, and his fears were confirmed on the 10th, when he heard her talking to a friend.
Georgina disclosed firstly that she was going to take Peter Morgan for all she could financially, and that she cared little, if anything at all, for him.
Georgina's plan was to get the bungalow signed over to her, then once that had happened, she was going to leave Peter.
To Peter, that kind of betrayal was probably bad enough, but then she went on to talk about using extortion to get what she ultimately wanted.
Georgina was also planning to blackmail him to let his family know about his use of escorts in particular, which they had no idea about, and that she would use that to get further monies from him.
Peter was concerned that an intimate video showing him and Georgina engaging in sexual acts would be disclosed to his estranged wife and his daughters. This was in fact a video that Peter Morgan had sent to Georgina himself.
And that was what had finally pushed Peter over the edge.
Had the existence of this video being revealed to the Morgan family. Undoubtedly, that would have caused great upset and concern to them.
For a well-respected, well-known family, it would have absolutely pulled the rug.
It was important to Peter Morgan that he appeared respectable. When Georgina threatened to blackmail Peter, threatened that respectability, essentially that shifted the power to her. And that was something that Peter was not going to allow to happen.
Peter Morgan made the conscious decision that if he couldn't have Georgina, then no one else could. He made the conscious decision that he was going to kill her.
Peter was very angry about this betrayal and spent the next 2 days brooding about what to do and planning about what to do.
On Peter's phone, investigators find a shopping list he made in the early hours of January 11th, the day before the murder.
He listed things he needed to obtain and items that were all used in Georgina's murder and the disposal of her body.
The list contained 8 items. Poly, which is short for polythene, handle, snips, string, and police were able to connect all of those items directly to Georgina's death.
Detectives also obtained closed-circuit camera footage recorded at his ex-wife's home on the day of the murder. It captures Peter's every move.
It showed Peter pulling up in his car, opening up the barn, opening his boot, taking the body out, and taking the body into the barn. The local story is that she'd put the CCTV in after he'd left, so he had no idea that there was CCTV there.
On January 14th, Peter Morgan is arrested and charged with the murder of Georgina Simmons. Coming up, Foundry Chambers prosecutors believe they have an open and shut case.
Everything he did was absolutely meticulous. It was down to the last millimeter.
But will a jury agree?
He was not guilty of murder on the grounds of diminished responsibility.
On November 28, 2016, Peter Morgan's trial begins. He stands accused of strangling 25-year-old escort Georgina Simmons to death 11 months earlier.
The idea of a multimillionaire being involved with escorts for a start is shocking enough. For a multimillionaire to murder an escort and to have all the sort of salacious details of that played out on a national front was incredible.
Although Peter has confessed to the crime, he pleads not guilty.
Peter denied the murder charge. He was claiming it was manslaughter, it was an accident, he'd only ever intended to frighten her.
Foundry Chambers prosecutors don't see it that way. They describe Peter as a man who was so obsessed that when he discovered Georgina was lying to him, he decided to make her pay.
Peter's reaction to what he had heard was one of absolute fury.
The prosecution case from the outset was this was a carefully planned and carefully executed murder. The planning took place over a number of days. Peter Morgan was meticulous in that planning, leaving no stone unturned. It was clearly in his mind and his intention to end Georgina's life, nothing less. Peter Morgan went to confront Georgina at the bungalow in Pencoed Castle. He had 2 mindsets. Either the matter could be resolved and things would be back to the way they were, according to him, or he would end her life.
He arrived just before 10 a.m. Georgina was on the phone to Alexei, making plans for later that day. When she hung up, they got into a heated argument and things escalated quickly.
It started as a disagreement about Peter paying the bills, but then he confronted Georgina about her plans to extort him.
At some stage during the argument, Peter takes the twine out of his pocket and he uses it to strangle Georgina to death. Then he wraps her body in the plastic sheeting and uses the gaffer tape to seal it all up. He uses the pole and ties the whole body and everything to the pole and uses it like a suitcase.
Peter then drove 20 minutes to Beach Hill Farm. He turned off Georgina's cell phone, he hid her body, and then he left.
It became fairly obvious through the police investigation that this was premeditated murder.
The fact that he had just gone laden with everything you need really did push the prosecution.
However, Peter's defense attorneys paint a very different picture for the jury.
Now, they say that Peter wasn't responsible for his actions when he killed Georgina because of diminished responsibility. Now, that's a way of saying, yes, you did it, but because of your state of mind, you didn't know what you were doing.
Peter's defense team claimed that the diminished responsibility was a result of him suffering from a form of Asperger's.
Those with Asperger's characteristically had difficulties with social interaction. They were essentially saying that Peter was incapable of handling his feelings about Georgina's betrayal the way you or I might have.
In order to rely on that defense, Peter Morgan called 2 medical practitioners, both of whom are very eminent psychiatrists and psychologists.
Those 2 experts corroborated what Peter's defense said, that Peter had got into this furious rage, didn't know what he was doing, and then when he realized what he'd done, he tried to hide it. That meant that the jury was free to ignore the charge of murder and could find Peter guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter.
In rebuttal, the prosecution calls their own psychiatric expert.
He did not agree with the finding of those 2 psychiatrists.
He said that mentally, Peter was fully capable of being aware of his own actions that night.
back on the road now. Here I go, going back on the road. When you back there again, play the music back there again. I saw the looking out of the window. Wonder if I could bring them down. If I could remind of your baby you made.
Shorty, if you really wanna go, baby, then you gotta take me the mess. I tried to soak in all the years and take it all in, but I come up for a breath and cry. I gave my promise, gave my